The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another episode of Frankly Speaking. I'm your host today, Frank Zabrick. I know it's been a spell since I've done one of these shows, but, things happen. What can I say? But anyway, I'm really excited about today's show because we're about, 13 months away from the first primaries, the Democrat primaries and the Republican primaries for what they call the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I guess America has to decide whether they're happy with the government they got now and maybe having like a socialist type government, and among other things, what might happen if the Democrats stay in office. The Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, I guess there's a push by the Democrats in Congress to make them states. And thus, if Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico become states, they're going to get 2 more U.S. senators and at least 1 representative each. And that will probably tilt the balance for like many years to come for the Democrats in Congress, and probably the presidency as well. And what else would happen also? They're pushing to Supreme Courts adding 4 what they call stacking the Supreme Court, adding 4 more justices to make them 13 total justices. But anyway, we'll talk about this as well as some other issues as they pop up, and there's no shortage of issues for next year's campaign, that's for sure. My guest today is a gentleman from Bedford, New Hampshire. And he's, I guess you haven't pulled papers yet officially, but you're officially like publicly announcing your candidacy to run for U.S. representative, U.S. congressman.
Correct. So I've filed all the federal paperwork that needs to be filed. You don't officially get into the race until June of next year when we file in the state house here in New Hampshire that you're officially going to be on the ballot. But I've done the paperwork so that I can raise money and start running. Raise money, spend money, exactly. So all that goes through the federal government.
Okay, and this is Robert Burns. Mm-hmm. Mr. Burns, how you doing today?
Wonderful, thank you.
So why don't we start off by telling my TV audience a little bit about yourself and why you feel inspired to run for U.S. representative next year?
Sure. So actually, I'm originally, at least I was born right here in the Gate City.
Okay.
Yeah, and my first home was actually in Amherst, New Hampshire, and then I grew up and went to the Bedford school systems. I went to Manchester West High School, and then I went to Keene State College out on the other side. So I've really always lived in New Hampshire. As I usually tell people, I've lived in New Hampshire my entire life, except for those times I didn't. But I've always been here with the exception of brief forays in other countries for studying abroad in school and stuff like that. So Canada, Mexico. And the United Kingdom, England. So a little bit about me. I come from a very political family. My mom was a state rep. I have uncles that have been state rep, multiple uncles that have been state reps. My uncle was county commissioner for Hillsborough County, so this county that we're in right here. Okay. My aunt was county treasurer. We were always very involved in presidential campaigns. My uncle worked for John Sununu, the first John Sununu when he was governor. He was economic director for the state of New Hampshire. And then I first ran for selectman of Manchester. I got elected. And then later on went to go run for county treasurer. And I beat Chris Pappas for county treasurer. And so, I represented the entire county of Hillsborough and worked, my office was there in Goffstown, New Hampshire as well. So, and then, I've worked heavily on various presidential campaigns. I was very high up in doing youth coalition stuff with Mike Huckabee back in 2008. Newt Gingrich, I was the assistant campaign manager here in New Hampshire for Newt Gingrich. And I was also doing coalitions with Donald Trump in 2016. That being said, it's always been kind of a part-time gig for me. With the exception of Newt Gingrich, I never took a paid role, nor was I ever working for any of these people full-time. I work in pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. I say pharmaceutical, that's about the majority of my business, and my largest customers are pharmaceutical, but we also work with candy and explosives as well. So, for example, all your airbags were tested on my equipment. Not the airbags that got recalled by Takeda. They actually had stopped doing a lot of the testing that we do. But so airbags are another big industry that we're in. But the vast majority of my industry is pharmaceutical production. But it can also be nutraceutical. Some people get upset when I say pharmaceutical, and it's like, well, I also make vitamins and CBD and things like that as well. I help to make it. We do automation and quality control.
Now, you told me a little bit about your situation over the phone, and you explained to me that Bedford, New Hampshire is kind of like in a funny position where it might get redistricted.
Sure. I mean,
right now, you're as it stands right now, Bedford's in the same district as Chris Pappas.
Correct.
And it might go.
So every 10 years we have redistricting, and honestly, anything can change. There's a lot of people throwing a lot of stuff out there right now,
Okay.
But I'm one of these candidates. First off, you don't have to live in a district to run in it.
That's true. You can always move after you're elected.
Well, no, you don't have to move at all. As long as you're in the same state, you're fine.
I did not know that.
And you only have to live in that state once you've been elected. And I say live in that state. I mean, do you think AOC really lives in New York? So,
good point.
But I'm kind of a unique situation. I mean, I've lived in New Hampshire my whole life, and I've clearly lived between both areas. Currently where I live, it's a stone's throw from the border. So all of these border towns could end up being moved during redistricting. We don't really know what's going to happen. I've ran for Congress before. I want to run in as many towns that I've run in the past. And quite frankly, being Hillsborough County Treasurer, I mean, 60% of the county, most of the towns, but 60% of the population's in 2. So I've represented more of 2 than I have 1. So it's kind of an interesting, you have all sorts of people saying crazy stuff. I mean, the GOP chair said Manchester is going to move to 2. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, the governor has said multiple times there's going to be very little changes. I've spoken to people high up in the governor's office and stuff that says, there's not going to be any extreme gerrymandering.
So, like right now, until you physically pull nomination papers, like next June or July, are you going like all over New Hampshire or just in one district as opposed to the other?
I'm really focusing on one district, but I mean, I am going to other towns that possibly could change. And I mean, Bedford and Merrimack are definitely in those areas, and so is Windham, Salem, Atkinson. That's what a lot of people keep bringing up. But as far as things go right now, the 2nd district needs 28,000 more people. So I hear a lot of people telling me about what towns are going to move out of the district, but many people aren't talking about what towns are going to move into the district. And right now, the only thing that the legislature has to do is probably move 1 medium-sized town over to 2.
Okay.
From 1 to 2, like a town like Merrimack.
Okay. So let's just take a look at your possible incumbent people, the incumbents going for re-election, maybe.
Right. So
because also one thing that's happening too, Chris Sununu, I guess, the governor, is debating with himself, I guess, on whether he wants to run for Senate against Maggie Hassan.
Right.
And if he runs for Senate against Maggie Hassan, Annie Custer, and Chris Pappas, there's a good possibility that one or maybe even both could run for governor.
Absolutely.
That's seems to be the progression of these people.
Right. So, I have a good idea of what's going to happen. I have a good idea of where I'm going to be running. There's no definites on who my opponents are going to be or what's going to happen at the end of the day. And I mean, sometimes we get into a black hole of just like discussing all the possibilities and the fantasy situations that could come out here. But I mean, that's all we're doing is like anything could happen.
Okay, so let's talk about the incumbents real quick, then we'll get into
Sure.
the issues. Chris Pappas, you've beaten before
Correct.
in another election.
Yes.
And so you've got a little bit of familiarity with him,
Sure.
or he does with you, depending on which way you want to look at it. And also, I notice I follow this thing, Red Eagle Politics. On YouTube, and they're predicting that the Republicans are saying that Chris Pappas's district is going to be very vulnerable for the Republicans. Did Trump do very well in Chris Pappas's district?
No, he lost, but he
lose.
won the first time in 2016. He lost both districts the second time. He didn't do very well in New Hampshire. He lost by 9 points. But here's the thing. So there's something called the PVI. It's called the Cook PVI. So currently the districts are considered an R+1, which means Republican +1, which means a Republican should have won by 1 point in that district. But a lot of that's influenced by how much the governor won by, and other Republicans that ran in those districts, because our federal candidates did really poorly last cycle. We lost a lot of typical Republican towns. So Trump was not the worst. It was our Senate seat that actually did the worst. And then the governor was like on the exact flip side. He won by over 30 points.
Okay.
So it's considered, CD1 is considered an R+1 and CD2 is considered a D+1. Now, that being said, with the way things are polling right now, we should be winning D+1s as well. But all things being equal, when a Republican runs, they should, statistically lose by 1 point in the second district and win by 1 point in the other district.
Okay.
Now, obviously, depending on the candidates, that's not an exact truth. That's not what we're going to see. But, we could see winning by a whole lot more. In 2010, when I ran, I beat Chris Pappas by 19 points, and Kelly Ayotte beat Paul Hodes, the congressman from CD2, by 20 points. 20 points.
Yeah.
That's huge. So if we see another sweep election, which I think we are going to, we're going to win both districts.
Okay, and now the other incumbent in question, Ann Custer, never ran against her.
Nope, not.
And but no, she's done extremely well against Steve Negron,
Right.
Who I guess won handily in the primaries. Well, then again, I think Steve Negron's from Nashua.
He is,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, he is.
So, of course, he's probably going to win the Republican primary against non-Nashua people, I would assume. But then again, there's a thing in politics, I guess, when a male candidate runs against a female, the male's expected to be a super gentleman, more so if it's you against another guy.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think we've seen that in the past where it kind of can blow up on somebody. But I mean, we saw Trump and
Hillary Clinton.
So I mean, that doesn't, that's not an absolute truth. And remember, Jim Lawrence ran the year before Negron, and he only lost by like 3.5%, I think. And I mean, he spent like $40,000. She spent like $2-3 million. So he came really, really close. Yeah, Steve did not do well, but Steve's problem, I don't want to sit here and dissect what went wrong with the campaigns, because I'm going to do things a lot differently. And yes, I am going to take Custer on more directly.
Okay, and Charlie Bass beat her once, and then she beat him once.
Correct.
In their, I guess they had 2 contests total.
Right.
Was he like a perfect gentleman, or did he kind of go free for all, like if he was running against a guy?
I actually don't really remember much of the 2012 campaign. So he beat her in 2010 when everybody got swept in. She ran because Paul Hodes was sitting congressman at the time, and he ended up running for Senate. I don't really remember too much about the campaign. I definitely know that there's stuff that he should have used and didn't. Maybe he thought just because he'd beat her before and he was the incumbent that he'd just get reelected, I guess.
Okay. But as it stands right now, as of August 2021, you have really no preference between Chris Pappas or Ann Custer.
No, I'd beat either one of them.
Sounds good to me. Okay. Now let's get into some of the issues, and I do have issues, believe
Sure.
it or not. The first and foremost, critical race theory. What is critical race theory?
Well, critical race theory is honestly different. I mean, I've read the Wikipedia on what it is, but trust me, when you see Republicans and Democrats arguing about what critical race theory is online, it's not always the same thing. I mean, I see people talking about, police departments, teaching this or that, or
Public school systems?
Yeah, I mean, some of
the military?
Right. Some of the stuff that on both sides isn't critical race theory. Like if you talk to a Democrat, to them, critical race theory is teaching us that slavery used to exist in the United States. Well, that's clearly not critical race theory. That's history. And then when you see some of the things that are being taught in schools about, like calling, white people having to call themselves oppressors or colonizers. And I mean, maybe some of this stuff is part of critical race theory in the 1619 Project, but it's ridiculous is what it is. And honestly, what we have is a lack of understanding of history in this country. And there's nothing that gets me, crazier than when we start talking about how, like, say, oppressed Hispanics have been in this country. I mean, the Spanish came here and colonized the United States long before the English did. I mean, they came and colonized the natives. And they brought slaves over something like 80 years before a slave was ever brought over by the way, the Portuguese. Some English pirates had stolen some Portuguese slaves from a Portuguese ship and then brought them to Virginia about 80 years after Ponce de Leon and the Spanish brought slaves to Florida. But for some reason, we like to erase certain parts of history and only talk about those, but other parts seem to make certain people uncomfortable because we feel like, this person, because the color of his skin might be slightly different, you're an oppressed minority. But the fact of the matter is, those people are direct descendants of Christopher Columbus and the Columbus expeditions. I mean, much to popular belief, Christopher Columbus didn't come here from Italy; he came here from Spain. His 3 ships were full of Spanish conquistadors.
So was it? I heard some banter. I don't know how big the push is to have reparations. I don't know how the heck they can arrange something like that to pay all Black Americans something for being slaves.
So recently, the government, they were going to forgive the PPP loans to, minority farmers, but under minority farmers, they were adding Asians and Hispanics and basically everybody who they deem as not white. I don't see how a Japanese American should be given reparations from the United States, considering, first off, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and second off, they used to colonize Asia. They tried to colonize the Philippines. They colonized South Korea. They did some really terrible stuff. They colonized China for a short period of time and did some really terrible things over there. So you're telling me just because of the color of your skin and your last name, all of a sudden you get free government money? That's ridiculous. And as we know, not every Black person in the United States is a descendant of a slave. And quite frankly, some are descendants of slave owners, and some are, came here from Africa, where, we have no idea what their descendants did.
I see. Okay, well, one more thing. Mathematics.
Sure.
Specifically algebra, geometry, and trigonometry.
Sure.
Is it racist to say, for example, there's only one correct answer in the math equations?
No, that's the beautiful thing about math, is usually there's only one correct answer.
I think
there's some theoretical maths and stuff out there, but in general, like, there's only one correct answer. 2 + 2 is really 4.
Yeah, I think if they do that, then for like engineering jobs in like 10, 20 years from now, you're only going to have Chinese people and India people.
Yeah, I mean, we really are handicapping ourselves with some of this ridiculousness. And we've seen this. I mean, we see this in Oregon right now. I mean, Kate Brown came out and signed a bill, so that all these people, didn't have to pass, be able to read and do basic math to get their high school diplomas. And of course, this was because mostly it was minorities that were falling behind. And that's what we're seeing. And so instead of addressing the problem and educating these people, she just says, oh, no, we'll just pass them without being able to read and do math. And you're not doing anybody any favors. So I used to live in Mexico, and I was down there I used to go to school in Mexico, and I was down there for Spanish immersion to learn how to speak Spanish. And one of the families that I lived with was a guy who was, living here in the United States, and he was never able to learn English in the United States because we made it so easy for him not to learn English. There were Spanish channels. He lived in, Florida or Miami. You go to the bank, they'll speak to you in Spanish. And so he was never able to learn Spanish. And we didn't do him any favors by that, enabling him not to learn the language. Now, if you come here from, say, some African country, or you come here from, Romania or you're Dutch or what have you, and you come to the United States, you have to learn English because nobody's going to facilitate these other languages. And obviously we've seen this a bit in northern New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont, where you do come across some elderly people sometimes who've lived in the United States their entire lives and they only speak French. We saw this with Paul LePage, who used to be the governor of Maine. And, he said he didn't really learn English until he got to college. The guy's from Maine. but we're not doing people favors by, lowering the standards for them. Great. You get a piece of paper at the end of the day, but it's a meaningless piece of paper.
What is cancel culture?
Yeah. So, obviously cancel culture is, I mean, the worst part I think with cancel culture is it's so unevenly used. And I don't know, as far as being a congressman, I don't know how you say, I'm going to cancel culture. But, I find it interesting that, somebody says something that somebody else finds racist or what have you, and they get canceled. But then you've got, comedians like Sarah Silverman, who wears blackface, has said some of the most horrible anti-Semitic stuff and not anti-Semitic, anti-Asian stuff. She is in fact Jewish. She probably has said anti-Semitic stuff as well, though. But yeah. And she can still get Disney movies. And Disney recently, fired a person on The Mandalorian, this TV show, for saying, for having conservative views. And that's problematic, but Hollywood is a joke in and of itself with their cancel culture and how unevenly they seem to use it. Like, oh, well, you get canceled, but you don't get canceled because maybe she didn't get canceled because she's a woman and she's Jewish. So then therefore she can say as much racist stuff as she wants. Whereas, I don't know, if you're a white man, I guess you can't, unless you're Jimmy Kimmel and now you've got the Late Show and I guess you get forgiven for dressing in blackface and doing all the misogynistic, sketches he used to do when he was younger. So it's very interesting. But
isn't there a push too that you and I would be considered by some racist by the fact that we're both born Caucasian?
Sure.
And we're currently Caucasian.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that's what that Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley.
Yeah.
I mean, he goes before Congress and testifies that he'd like to have all the military go through critical race theory to check their whiteness. Especially,
yeah, and I mean, and this is problematic. I mean, listen, if it wasn't for my ancestors, I mean, people like him would, we'd still have slavery. It was the Scotch-Irish that basically, I mean, we fought against each other. It was North versus South. But when you look at the names of the people who were fighting, they were almost all Scotch-Irish. They were almost all Scottish and Irish in names and stuff like that. When you look at all the major generals and the people that were dying in this war, against North versus South. And, when you think about the Scotch-Irish coming to this country of the United States, first off, we didn't colonize the United States. The United States was colonized by the English, by the French, by the Spanish, a little bit by the Dutch, which I'm not a descendant of any. My ancestors mostly come from Scotland, which was colonized by the English, and then we were used as essentially bullet catchers for a number of years by the English, in their wars. And and unfortunately, at times they even used us against the Irish, which were our brothers. They were our brothers and sisters, the same way the North and the South did. But and again, I'm a Northern Scotch-Irish person, and I have family members that were abolitionists, they were Quakers, That's my German side, though. A little bit of German.
No.
We fought these wars to liberate these people. And now it's like the descendants of the people who liberated the slaves are now called racist based merely on their skin color, because the English and the French and the Spanish came here and colonized a country 250 years ago that we didn't colonize.
I see.
Yeah.
But you told me before on the phone, before this show, that in your profession, whatever you do, if you're a salesman or a representative or something
Pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment. Yeah, so we sell implemented into
So,
the customers.
okay,
and
well,
stuff.
whatever happens in this campaign, for example, like if you're a staunch Annie Custer supporter or a staunch Chris Pappas supporter, they're saying, oh, Robert Burns is obviously a racist.
Right. Well,
he's a
fortunately,
systemic racist.
Fortunately, I work in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and I'm in a very niche area, and there's not a lot of people that do what I do. So the big pharmaceutical companies out there really don't have the power to replace me easily. So it's a nice thing about actually like producing something. Now, obviously, Custer is very close with the pharmaceutical guys, but she's close with the lobbyists and the sales guys that sell the drugs. You know, I'm with the guys, the scientists that make the drugs, and they don't usually care what your political beliefs are. It's just about getting it done and making drugs and making people better.
And I'm just saying, okay, let's say nationwide, you've got like people running for senators, governors, U.S. reps, and that are, maybe in like work in Raytheon as an assembly worker or something like that, or just a regular supervisor. If you put their names on, John Smith is obviously a racist, a systemic racist, and you put it on a website, like Facebook or Twitter, and that goes over the internet, a potential employer is going to look at the internet. They may Google you and say, oh, well, I can't hire Robert Burns. He's a systemic racist.
Right.
It says it right here in Facebook and Twitter.
Well, and I think we've had, definitely in the public sector, that's one of the nice things about the public sector employees is we've had some of that happen, and people have come back and sued the public sector over it, which is easier to do than the private sector, and they've won those lawsuits. We had one went to the Supreme Court. That one wasn't about racism, but it's interesting because I think it will affect it. But a girl was singing along with some popular music of the day, which might have had some racist lyrics in it, but it was, because it was rap music or what have you. And so then she had her offer to go to like the University of Alabama or Arkansas, one of them, rescinded. And there was a recent Supreme Court, but it wasn't about the racist term, but it was about a cheerleader who, had used some vulgar language like on a TikTok or a YouTube video or something like that. And the Supreme Court said, no, like your public school cannot punish you for your freedom of speech, outside of the school. So I think that we're going to start seeing some of these schools and stuff who've kicked kids out for things that they've said are going to start to lose because it's First Amendment, and your First Amendment is protected, especially in public schools or in public, by the public system. Now, private system's a little bit harder. If you say something and the company says, well, we don't want people who say things like that representing our company, there's not as much you can do about it. Because it's a private company, they can make certain decisions on their own. Obviously, we have, though, told, private companies that, you can't discriminate based on, the way that you look. So if you can go after them if it seems like they're discriminating you just because you're a Republican, let's say, or because of the person that you support. And I think that we have lawsuits out there like that. And that's where we're going to see a lot of this play out.
Okay. So let's move on to the actual issues, probably the nuts and bolts that you probably will debate people like Annie Custer and Chris Pappas over. What do you think about the exit of the American troops from Afghanistan?
Well, obviously we had to do it at some point, but this was the worst way to do it possible. I think the biggest concern and what we need to focus on is some of the weapons that we've left there and why we left them. So I was reading something today, and I don't know, it was on Facebook. I don't know if it was the exact, correct amount, but I heard that there was 16,000 NVGs left. Those are night vision goggles. Okay. So if you've never used night vision goggles, particularly with some of the other equipment, because the night vision goggles actually then, there's a second component. There's lasers and lights that you can only see with the night vision goggles. And they're actually manufactured here in New Hampshire by companies like Insight Technologies. It totally changes the game on the battlefield, because at night you can't see anything. With night vision goggles, you can see everything. And one man is an army of one when they have the proper equipment. And we left them some of our best technology, and they are better armed now than they've ever been. And I mean, you remember back in the 1980s when we were giving the Mujahideen land-to-air missiles, and then even in the initial incursion into Afghanistan, I mean, one of those missiles was used to blow up a Chinook helicopter, I think killing something like 27, 30 Marines, something like that. We gave them those weapons. Now we gave them even better weapons. The second weapon that we should be very concerned about that they have a huge supply of is Simtex C4. Okay, it's an extremely malleable, small, very powerful explosive. This is the type of stuff that when you watch movies, movie terrorists get their hands on. Real terrorists never seem to get their hands on this stuff. Now we just gave it to them, a whole bunch of it. And we should be very concerned about that Simtex coming back into the United States and used in terroristic ways. And then we can go down all the other countless weapons that we left them. But those are the two that I'm very concerned about. And we should have never left those types of weapons in the first place.
Assuming you're elected in next year, November of 2022, and you go for the new, and then let's say the Republicans have now the majority. Let's hypothetically say the majority in both the Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. Would you push to impeach Joe Biden just because of his actions in Afghanistan?
Of course not, because Kamala Harris is even worse. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, it's like it's asinine. The guy's going to be there for 2 years, 2 more years after that, and we're going to be done. Well, I mean, honestly, hopefully he's there for 2 more years after that, because I don't want Kamala Harris as president. I really don't. I think that she would be far worse.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And one thing that I heard some of the pundits say is, like, in the Trump administration, like the first 7-8 months, he had people fired. Like, he probably had like a half a dozen people fired his first 7 or 8 months. It happens. Yeah, it does. You just pick a bad person. And it's amazing that nobody got fired because of the Afghanistan situation. And they were mentioning people like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken.
Right. Well, I think it would be too early because we're so midstream into what's going on. I think firing anybody would honestly just make everything worse. And then the other thing, too, is I don't think that any really competent person wants to step up, because it's such a disaster that you don't want to own that disaster. These guys are already going to have to own the disaster, and they're going to have to figure out some way to get out of it and make it not quite as bad as it is today, or hopefully that the American people forget, because we have short memories. But they've made so many mistakes at this point that I don't think anybody wants to own those mistakes.
And one thing, the gentleman I named too, Lloyd Austin, Mark Milley, Anthony Blinken, how do you know they didn't keep Joe Biden informed up front? They weren't telling him all this stuff that the Taliban is running rampant in Afghanistan.
Honestly, if you tell Joe Biden anything, does he really even understand what's going on? I mean, there's so many times where he's just completely seems to lose it and does not actually seem to be all there. So I don't think that Joe Biden is really the guy in charge that's pulling all the strings. I think that there are other people in charge pulling the strings. And I mean, but these guys, and it is a lot even in the military, because there's a lot of top brass at the military that,
yeah. But Okay, so moving right along, I mentioned in the introduction about, for example, if the Democrats keep the majority next year after the in the House of Representatives and Senate, they will most likely push to make Washington D.C. and Puerto Rico states, official states, and get two more senators. Well, two more senators in each territory, and they'd get at least one more rep from Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C.
So they would get Puerto Rico alone, I think, would get like 5 or 6
Reps?
Oh yeah, there's 4.5 million people there.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So okay, so here's the thing. Number one, the Democrats are not pushing to bring in Puerto Rico. Chuck Schumer has completely come out against it. AOC is 100% against it. And her reasoning for it is because a lot of Americans don't realize that Puerto Rico is really conservative, and their only federal non-voting congresswoman right there is a Republican. So it's Jessica Colon. So the Republicans are actually kind of in charge of Puerto Rico at the moment. So they absolutely do not want Puerto Rico. Chuck Schumer had previously said that he was going to push for Puerto Rico and has now said he is not going to push for Puerto Rico once he's been given the facts. Puerto Rico would be a purple state like New Hampshire. It's had plenty of Republicans there. I remember when Mitt Romney was running for president, he was actually talking about the governor of Puerto Rico being one of his running mates. That was Fortunio. I worked in Puerto Rico for 20 years.
Oh, okay.
It's an extremely conservative area, especially socially. Okay, you're talking. This is the only place where, like, recently they built a 13-story statue of Christopher Columbus. Could you imagine anybody in the United States getting away with that today? So, I mean, this is a place, like, when you talk about ripping down statues, every corner in Puerto Rico has a statue of a colonizer. So they've been trying to rip down statues of Ponce de Leon, done in Florida, right? So he's the guy who colonized Florida. Well, of course, he was also the first governor of Puerto Rico. He was the first mate to Christopher Columbus.
Okay.
So
Washington, D.C.
Well, Washington, D.C. is different. Now, what should happen with Washington, D.C. is it should be returned to Maryland if they want to vote. So Washington, D.C. used to be a complete square. And then out across the Potomac, there was a little corner there. That's where, like, Pentagon City, Crystal City is. That used to be Virginia. Then the rest of it used to be Maryland. So we went in there and we made this perfect square. Well, eventually people in the other side of the river were like, hey, we're on the other side of the river. We're not really part of you guys. We feel more part of Virginia. Put us back into Virginia. So we put them back into Virginia. Okay. Making Washington, D.C. a state is absolutely ridiculous. And yes, they absolutely want to do it. Now, Washington, D.C. has 2 or 3 million people. I mean, they would get 4 or 5 reps as well.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
So the trade-off would be is you get no senators, you put most of D.C., but not them all, back part of Maryland, and then Maryland would get a few more reps.
Oh, okay.
That's the compromise, but the Democrats don't want to do that because, and it's the thing that makes sense, and it's the fairest, but the Democrats don't want to do that because, of course, they want 2 more U.S. senators. And they don't want Puerto Rico to be a state because, AOC has come out. So AOC's family is a very anti-statehood. She believes that Puerto Rico should separate from the United States.
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Well, I mean, think about it. If you're a Puerto Rican and you want to be part of the United States, why do you think that is? You're probably conservative, you're probably a Republican, and you probably were in the military. Puerto Rico is a huge military, island. Many of them serve in the United States Armed Forces all across. I mean, Puerto Ricans have received many, Congressional Medal of Honors. And what's funny about Puerto Rico that people don't realize too is, like, during the Second World War, like, Puerto Ricans fought along, like, Americans, like any of us. Whereas, like, Mexican Americans or Chicanos, we actually had separate divisions for them. So Puerto Ricans were always considered more part of the United States than even other people.
Okay, so if the Democrats keep both the House and the Senate, hypothetically,
they want to push Washington, D.C. as a state, absolutely, but it's never going to happen because we've got Democrats like Joe Manchin from West Virginia that would never vote for it.
Okay,
so there are a number of Democrats that know how ridiculous that is and that would never vote for it. I assume Kristen Sinema would never vote for it as well, but people see it for what it is. It's just a power grab.
I see.
And the smartest thing to do is what I just mentioned, but the Democrats are never going to go for that anyway either. Even though it probably would give them a few more House seats, they'll never do it because they're always going to, they're waiting for that moment when they do have a supermajority where then they can just steal the whole thing. But I think if they were to do that, then they would lose their majority very fast. What you have to remember is the vast majority of states, I mean, like, Republicans usually win because most states are rural, right? So a lot of these guys who are in rural places, or like a Kristen Sinema from Arizona, they want to keep winning. Or Joe Manchin from West Virginia, or we've got guys from Montana. You know what I'm saying? You always have these random, like, senators who might have got in a mostly Republican state, and they're not going to do anything too crazy if they want to keep their jobs. Now, if they do something too crazy, they're all going to lose. Okay.
I see.
And remember, like, it's usually like when you look at Republican governors versus Democrat governors, it's usually like 30 Republicans across the country and like 20 Democrats. So the majority of the states are usually Republican. There's no reason that Republicans shouldn't actually win the Senate every year. It's actually surprising when we don't, like last time, although it's 50-50, but
yeah.
I mean, we should have picked up those 2 seats in Georgia, for example.
So are you a big fan of stacking the Supreme Court?
No.
To 13?
No, absolutely not. That's also ridiculous.
So do you think, assuming that the Democrats win both the House, keep both the House and the Senate next year, you don't think the Supreme Court will get stacked?
No, I don't think that they're ever going to have enough votes, because they're going to have to pull votes from Republican states, and then senators who are going to have to vote for it, who are going to vote for it, then lose their job if they stack it. And you can't continue with this tit for tat and keep changing the rules thing. People don't like that. I mean, so when I get into office, I'm just going to change all the rules. Like, people do not like that, and people always react badly to that.
When you say change all the rules once you get in office, wasn't that Joe Biden's thing on day one? He had a stack of executive orders, and he flipped every single thing Donald Trump did.
I'm not a big fan of executive orders to begin with, but I mean, like, a lot of his executive orders honestly really didn't have a lot of teeth to them. I remember we had a shooting in a grocery store, and he said he was going to bring all these new gun laws in. I'm unaware that he's been able to pass any new gun laws or get anything done of his executive orders. He said he was going to go after ghost guns with an executive order. Nothing's happened there. So his stuff doesn't have a whole lot of teeth, and he knows it. And if they were really trying to push a lot of it, it would just get killed in the current Supreme Court. So he's almost just playing politics, but I mean, it's the red meat for Republicans, and I guess it's the red meat for Democrats, because you pretended like you got something done, and we're like, he's taking away all our freedoms. But I still don't have any problem going out and buying a gun. So I don't feel like, and I can still buy ghost guns, although they're tough to get, because getting the 80% lowers online, because there's always a backlog of orders, because everybody thinks that they're going to be banned soon, and they might be, and we need to be diligent and keep out there fighting, but he hasn't done anything yet. And he's going to have a lot of trouble.
Okay, they got my goat after this past presidential election, that I think the Republicans, if they get the majority, they got to do something. Big tech.
Nope.
You got to regulate them, or at least make it possible to get them sued.
Yeah, so exactly. And there's, this has been kind of a ridiculous thing. I mean, when we talk about how much we still regulate the airwaves or radio, and then it's like, Facebook, do whatever you want. And it's like, so, I'm definitely kind of an anti-regulation guy, but it's like, but we seem to have this double standard out there, and it doesn't make sense to me, because we created these regulations because we wanted fairness with the radio, the television, because we saw how powerful they were of tools for politicking. But then we don't seem to hold the internet to any of those same regulations. And I mean, it's not just like big tech banning, Donald Trump from being able to speak and stuff like that. We've seen, like PayPal and stuff, and some of these, funding websites not allowing, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. And I mean, that's real political suppression. I mean, that's scary stuff, that, like, if I want to run a campaign, but then I can't take, credit cards, or I can't get a bank account. It's not just the tech, but it's, because we look at the PayPals and stuff because they are banks, but then we can even just look at banks alone. And we say, yes, you have freedom to, like, associate and who you decide to do business with. But at a certain point, certain services are almost necessary today, or necessary to run for office. And if Facebook just says, oh, no more Republicans allowed, we can't do that. I mean, of course, their stock would tank if they did that, because you would be getting probably rid of 30-40% of your subscribers. So obviously it's going to be troublesome for them to do that, but we've seen them do it on a smaller level, like something called shadow banning, where if I post something maybe about abortion or guns, it's not going to get delivered as much at a higher rate. Now, where we do have legal ground to stand on is if I'm paying for an ad on Facebook and they're shadow banning me, then they're stealing from me, and I absolutely have a lawsuit against them.
I see. I think what people are kind of up in arms about, like when Trump gets banned from both Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and while the Taliban and the Chinese leader can say anything they darn well please.
No, exactly. And honestly, that needs to stop. I mean, you're either going to go the way of freedom of speech or you're going to regulate it. And then if you're going to regulate it, that's your standard, is going to be like the Taliban's okay, but Donald Trump says mean things. I mean, that and it does need to be regulated by the government at a certain level. But, like I said, I don't like to be the guy out there saying, hey, I want to bring in some more regulation here. But, it's turning into, Facebook and some of these websites, they have such a, monopoly or oligopoly that you really do need some sort of, oversight and regulation, that they can't just censor everybody that they don't agree with.
I see. Okay, let's move on to the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol building. Mm-hmm. The dozen or so, maybe hundreds, I don't know, there are a lot of people in jail because they stormed into the Capitol building. Sure. And they never got their day in court. They're still in jail 7-8 months later since that incident. And do you believe they got due process?
Well, I think a lot of people are being processed through right now. I mean, I'm unaware that somebody's been in for 7 months and hasn't gotten any due process yet. I was unaware of that. So, there's a guy.
Well, I could have a wrong info.
Well, there's a guy from New Hampshire. He's actually talking about running against Custer too, but he broke into Chuck Schumer's office and stole a bottle of wine. I mean, he's been to court. I know that he's not in prison right now. I mean, and I know some people have been sentenced, but I'm unaware of anybody who's been in for 7 months that hasn't had a court date yet. That I'm unaware of. And if there is, then that's a serious issue. I mean, the people should be going to jail for that.
Okay, I'll have to research that a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I'm
aware. I'm aware of a number of people that have been in there. Some people were in jail. Some people are out. But I've been aware of a number of people who've gotten court dates. Some have pled guilty. Some have pled not guilty. So I've heard some stuff back and forth.
The Capitol police officer that shot and killed Ashley Babbitt. Mm-hmm. Actually, incidentally, the only person who was killed in that insurrection. Right. And a lot of the Democrats are comparing that to the worst one since 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, where there was 3,000 in each of those incidents.
I think people have
bombed
bombed and shot up the Capitol building before, and of course, remember the Canadians burned down the White House. But
do you think that Capitol? Well, I mean, one of the rumors surrounding the Capitol police officer that shot him is he was a black gentleman, which that shouldn't make any difference. But in this climate, political climate, it does seem to make a difference. It was a white guy like Derek Chauvin of Minnesota that killed a black guy like George Floyd. Then they'll say, oh, we can't have that. But if it's opposite, then, it's no big deal. It doesn't fit the narrative of the Black Lives Matter folks.
Right.
So do you think that he got his due process? The guy who shot, most people don't know the man's name who shot Ashley Babbitt.
Well, that's problematic. I mean, obviously, I'm not one of the investigators, but I do think that one of the problems as a Republican that we keep putting out this double standard, though. We like to go out with our platitudes and go back the blue, back the blue. They're never wrong. That person definitely deserved to get shot. Now we have a cop who shot a woman, and we say, oh, but this one you shouldn't have shot. That's problematic of Republicans when we do that. I think that we do need more oversight of the police, and I think that we do need more transparency in these cases, and not just the ones that I'm only concerned about. And the same thing from the Democrats. I think that they've been very double standard on a lot of this stuff. I mean, we've got Democrats going out there saying that we need to defund the police, while then they were bringing in these police officers who were crying up there in Congress and saying what heroes they all were, and how they all have PTSD now, I guess, from it. So both the Republicans and Democrats need to come to a place in the middle here, where we obviously do need oversight, and we need to make sure that police aren't trampling on our constitutional rights. This is something that's really near and dear to me. I hate to see this in the Republican Party, but I remember, for example, a woman was arrested in Manchester, New Hampshire, because she had a gun in her glove compartment. She had a baby in a booster seat or something buckled in, and the police officer arrested her because he felt that that gun just being in the glove compartment is too close, and the child can have access to it. So they arrested this woman. Completely ridiculous. She ended up getting off. But we have to remember that was a police officer who arrested him, not some prosecutor, not some liberal, senator somewhere. But many times it is police officers who are trampling on our constitutional rights and our Second Amendment. And that we have to be aware of that. And we can't just go out there and say the police are always right and everybody else is the criminal. But at the same time, we also defunding the police is a completely ridiculous statement that leads to anarchy. And I, when I see both Republicans and Democrats doing what they're doing, I'm like, listen, I don't agree with either of you guys. I think that we have good police, we have bad police, we need oversight, we need transparency, but at the same time, we also need laws, and we need these people. I mean, when you're being, you can be the most pro-cop guy in the world, but when you're being pulled over by the police, you always feel like, oh, boy, I like cops, but not that one. And we need to be realistic about it. We need to have a better conversation about it too. And we need to point out all the hypocrisy on both sides.
Now let's flip the switch to the summer before. Well, actually, like 1 year ago right now.
Right.
Where the major cities, like in Portland, Minneapolis, Seattle, New York,
Portland, Oregon.
Well, Chicago, they still have.
They spent weeks trying to burn down a federal court building. Like, it's no different. It's federal government property. You don't burn it down.
And I heard, I think it was one of the rallies that Donald Trump is having now, saying like his one big regret about his presidential administration, he should have overrid the mayors who were saying this is their mostly peaceful protests. The one in Seattle says this is the summer of love, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, people were getting killed, dozens of people getting killed, property burnt down, looted.
I'd say the federal government stays out until you step on federal government land and you try to burn down a federal court building. Then I say you send in everybody. I mean, I don't care. You got the FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals in there with machine guns. I'm sorry. Arson's no joke. And I mean, we saw this after Minnesota. Like, there's homeless guys that ended up getting burned in these buildings that these people were setting on fire. I mean, they're murderers, and nobody was ever caught for that. Arson is a serious crime, okay? And it's extremely dangerous and extremely destructive. If somebody is trying to set fire to a building, a car, or whatever, and the police officer shoots them, I say he's 100% in his right.
I agree.
So I would say, hey, listen, if you want to burn down your own city, because I think these mayors have got hurt. I mean, look at all the tax revenue New York lost alone. I mean, they're hurting from that. So it's like, hey, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
It's almost as if, though, the mayors were setting up Donald Trump, saying, if he's such a great president, why can't he have law and order in all these major cities?
Right. It's a catch-22, but it's really up to a lot of those cities too. If the mayor of Chicago is fine with all the shootings and stuff that happens over there, that's Chicago. I'm not fine with it in New Hampshire, and we don't have it in New Hampshire because we have a government that works here. And we have a well-armed populace as well. You can't do that in New Hampshire.
Okay.
But this is what they want, and they want to live in a trashy city with crime out of control. There's only so much the federal government can do to step in. I'm not big into sending federal troops into like Chicago. I'm not going to be that guy. I mean, it's got to get pretty bad before we start sending in the National Guard.
Okay. I just think that even though he might be considered, the president might be considered a dictator,
Right. Well,
saying,
yeah.
you're still kind of responsible for their property and lives. I don't know.
It's a dangerous route to go down, but I also believe that the citizens out there protecting their property, who were targeted even by the police and stuff like that after arrested or what have you for protecting themselves, absolutely they should not be prosecuted for protecting themselves and their property. Everybody has that right. We have that right. That's in the Constitution. I mean, we have that right to protect ourselves and our property.
Wow. So time flies when you're having fun, eh, Robert?
Yeah, it does.
My producer just told me we have, about 2.5 minutes left till this episode. Is there anything that we've talked about which you'd like to elaborate on, or something we have not talked about which you'd like to bring up at this time?
Well, one of the big things, we talked a little bit about what I do for work, and it's the supply chain. And unfortunately, during COVID, in a way, COVID was was kind of a mixed bag, because it did get people to start focusing on our supply chain and why we're making so many things out of the country that we don't make here anymore. And there were concerns over getting those products. Now, I work in pharmaceuticals, and virtually all our pharmaceuticals now are being made overseas. Okay. And, this is like blood pressure medication. This could be diabetes medication, stuff like that. Could you imagine if we were to get into a skirmish with a China, and then all of a sudden they cut off all our pharmaceuticals? That's something that we need to pay attention to. And, so it's sometimes disasters, get us prepared for something that could be much worse down the line. And I think that's what COVID did a little bit. It raised an alarm, but now that COVID has subsided a little bit, or at least the supply chain problems have subsided a little bit, people aren't talking about the supply chains anymore. And that's one thing that I'd really like to focus on if I got into Congress, is supply chain, and particularly for those things that we absolutely need, like pharmaceuticals. But there's also different things like military weapons, drones, things like that shouldn't be being produced overseas, especially in China, that we do need to be talking about. We need, because you need some basic elements. Like, we need to be able to produce our own food. We need to be able to produce our own energy. We need to be able to produce our own
pharmaceuticals. Do you think our kids, our public school kids, or even private school kids, should be able to go back in the classroom this September?
Absolutely. I think the rate COVID is killing children, especially, it's more detrimental to their health not going to school. It's more detrimental to their health and their well-being in the future, not learning and not integrating with people. And we've seen a lot of problems, and there will be problems for years to come because of that. Anyway, one thing I'd just like to tell everybody before we end here is, visit my website. It's burns4nh.com. And again, I'm Robert Burns, and I'm running for Congress in the 2nd District of New Hampshire.
There we go. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, if this has been a blessing, definitely go on to Mr. Burns' website. There's a lot of good stuff on it. A lot of issues that we haven't covered are probably on that website, I'm sure. And stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, and join me next time for an episode of Frankly Speaking. Thank you very much.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.